Most of us love a good story. Some prefer true stories of great battles, epic journeys, and adversity overcome. Some prefer works of fiction, a princess rescued, wizards and witches, flights to faraway worlds, or mysteries to be solved. Jesus knew our love for stories and used them to teach us more about Him. Join us for story time.
As this can be a difficult subject, and so I'm going to start off with a difficult story. It was a very difficult time in my life. We were married and we had kids, and we were living in St. Joseph, Missouri. If you've known me very long, I've talked about this before with several people because it did impact our lives greatly. Not just mine, but my entire family's life was heavily impacted by our time in Missouri. I was working there at a church, and I was the youth and families pastor. So I worked with 6th through 12th graders and their families was the idea. I was only there about a year and a half before I was asked not to be there anymore. And that's just a nice way of saying it, before I was fired. And one of the reasons I was fired is because I asked to be, actually. And as I tell the story, that you'll start to understand why. And I'm not going to give a ton of details. And if you want more detail, I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. But we're just not going to spend a ton of time talking about it this morning because the details aren't important. The outcome is. Okay? Or they're not important to what we're going to talk about this morning. That's why I should phrase that. So I was serving at this church, and I come in, and I didn't know a lot of the problems the church had. I knew that the last youth pastor had also been fired. I did not know the guy before him was fired, and the guy before him left before he could be fired, which when that's the history, that tells you that it's probably not the youth guy that is the problem. And so we were struggling. It was probably the hardest year and a half of my career. I didn't admit it at the time, but looking back, I struggled with depression during this time because I was constantly being attacked, not as a pastor, but as a person, and as a pastor as well. So as the job I was doing as a student pastor, but also just as an individual, I was constantly being attacked by people in the church, and it was not the whole church; it was just a couple of them. The majority of the church is an amazing church still to this day. Most of the people that attend that church are absolutely amazing people, but there was just a handful. And one of those was the guy that came on as pastor at the time. And he has since been fired because of some of his anger issues. And my prayer has become that God used that to help him work through those. But there's a couple things I had to do. After being fired, I was somewhat angry towards the church. And I'm not talking about that particular church, just the church in general. I did not know that I wanted to go back into being a pastor again. And so I spent 2 years trying my best not to, because I was tired, I was burnt out. And then the other thing I had to come to this realization that while I may have been fired and for really reasons that when we look back we're like, those weren't fireable reasons, some of it was my fault. I had to take ownership of my portion in what took place. Because when I was confronted with these issues, I, in my immaturity, tried to avoid them. I tried to ignore them. I tried not to handle them. And it wasn't that they were necessarily issues that needed to be, like I needed to do something different. I just completely chose not to acknowledge that these people had a problem with something I was doing, which made those problems just compound. And it made things build and build and build. And yes, if I had addressed those issues because they weren't actually issues that were a problem, they just thought I should do something different than what I was. So it was a personal opinion. But because I didn't go, hey, this is how God has called me to do these things and this is why, and talk through those things just got worse and worse. Now, on the other side of that, they could have come directly to me and not come to somebody else and handled it that way too. So there was two parts to this issue. And before I could fully forgive what happened and what the people did, I had to understand that I played a part and that I had to be okay with that. And then once I was willing to acknowledge that fact, acknowledge my portion of it, I was able to offer forgiveness. Now, that was not easy, and it took me 2 years, honestly, to get to that point. It took me some time. And we took 2 years that I was not serving on staff at a church or actively, I was volunteering at a church, but we weren't, like if I didn't show up a Sunday morning, it wasn't the end of the world kind of thing. It wasn't like, well, we're not going to have a message. You know, it wasn't that kind of thing. It was I could easily hand it off to somebody else and just not be there if I needed to be. And so we took that time to kind of refresh and reset a little bit as a family. And I took that time to understand what it means to give forgiveness in a difficult situation. Now, I use this as an example of personal story where I had to offer forgiveness in an area that was not easy to offer it. And before we moved to Iowa, I wrote a letter to this pastor of this church telling him, hey, I've forgiven you for everything that happened. Some of the things that I think were an issue really weren't. I'm sorry that I made those issues, but I forgive you for everything else too. And then there were other people involved that I didn't write letters to them. I just didn't feel like I should or felt like I had to, but I still forgave them. We've all experienced hurt in some level. Some of us, the hurt runs really, really deep. And those are even more difficult situations to forgive. And one of the things that I'm not here to say you need to do it right now or you need to do it this way. One of the things that we're going to look at today is this idea that we do need to offer forgiveness no matter what the hurt is. And here's the reason. It's not for the other person involved. It's not to excuse what happened. Because there are some things that happen to people in this world that are without excuse. Abuse of whatever type. There's no excuse. And I'm not saying that you forgive that person like it never happened. I'm saying that forgiveness is not even for them. Forgiveness is more for us than it is for the other person involved. Here's why. Forgiveness and bitterness are two sides of the same coin. They're both on the same coin of hurt. One side you've got bitterness and you can choose to hang on to that, and the other side is forgiveness, which is where you choose to let go of that hurt and the control that person still has over you because of it. Bitterness and forgiveness, same side, two sides of the same coin. Today, as we walk through our passage, we're going to look at two examples of this idea of forgiveness and this idea of bitterness, or one example of forgiveness and really one idea of more bitterness. And they're the same person that experiences both. Remember, we're talking about stories, or parables is what we call them. So there's stories that Jesus told to teach a truth, to help us understand more about Him and how He affects us and how He's come to change us and to bring healing. So today we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 18, verse 21 is where we're going to start. What we're going to see there is that we offer forgiveness because Christ first forgave us. We don't offer forgiveness just because. We do it because He did it first. He set the example. And we're going to learn and we're going to dig in further about exactly what that means. Matthew chapter 18, verse 21. Then Peter approached Him and asked, Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? As many as 7 times? I tell you, not as many as 7, Jesus replied, but 70 times 7. 70 times 7. All right, we'll go a little further in just a moment, but first I wanted to stop and point out something that's happening here. Peter comes to Jesus and asks this question, right? His hope is he's going to ask this question and he's going to get a pat on the back from Jesus, like, nice job, way to go the extra mile. And the reason we would say he was trying to go the extra mile is that the common teaching from rabbis or teachers at the time in the Jewish life, in Jewish culture, common teaching was for this exact question, the average rabbi would go 3 times. You forgive them 3 times, and if they sin against you again, you don't have to forgive them anymore. Fourth, and they're done. 3 strikes, and they're out. And so Peter's like, how about 7 times? I'll forgive them 7 times. Jesus is going to like this answer. It's going to make him happy. He's going to go, good boy, Peter. But that's not the response he gets. Jesus doesn't condemn him, but he's like, no, that's not far enough. 7 times, not enough. He says 70 times 7. It's the idea of it doesn't matter how many times they sin against you. You're going to forgive them. I've called you to go further than anybody else. I've called you to do more than anybody would ever expect. Now, that doesn't mean that you continue to allow them to abuse you over and over again. Sometimes forgiveness is going, I forgive you, but I've got to walk away from this relationship. I can't continue to be here. And so you have to leave. You can forgive and not be present. Those things can work together. Our world, we like to use the adage, forgive and forget. That is like the worst thing ever. Because you're not going to forget the pain. You're not going to forget what happened, but you can forgive what happened. And you can choose to walk away if needed. Forgetting's like it never happened. The reality is it still happened. That event still shaped your life. It still affects who you are. Forgiveness says, you know what? This has shaped me. I've learned a lesson. I can be stronger because of what happened. I can either choose to let this event shape me, or I can go, you know what? I'm going to shape myself because of this event. And I can choose to not be around this person if necessary. That's not what, Jesus is not saying that forgive them and then just keep going right back if they're just going to constantly be a jerk. That's not what he's saying. But that's what we think it is. We want to go that direction with it. So Jesus is saying going further than anybody else ever has. And then he tells a story that kind of gives a ridiculous comparison. We're going to look at the first part of the story and talk a little bit, and then we'll look at the last part of the story because it's the same servant is involved, but it's 2 different occasions that Jesus talks about. So verse 23. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. So one thing really quick, as soon as he says the kingdom of heaven, we know that he's going to go further than what any of his audience expected. He's going to go deeper with this conversation than what Peter really hoped for. But that's what he's going to get. His disciples and all those that are listening are going to get much more. All right, can be compared to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. Verse 24. When he began to settle accounts, one who owed 10,000 talents, which at the moment means nothing to us, but I'll explain it here in a little bit, was brought before him. Since he did not have the money to pay it back, his master commanded that he, his wife, his children, and everything he had be sold to pay the debt. At this, the servant fell face down before him and said, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you everything." Then the master of that servant had compassion, released him, and forgave him the loan. All right, so those of you that are finance people, you're going to be excited about this. The rest of you are going to be like, okay, whatever. But bear with me, I promise. It helps us understand the dynamic of what's going on better. So we're going to do a little bit of biblical payroll for a moment, okay? So we have this idea of a talent that's mentioned. 1 talent equals 6,000 denarii. All right, 6,000 denarii. The first servant owed 10,000 talents, which is equal to 60 million denarii. That's a lot, because 1 denarii equaled 1 day's pay for labor. He owed 60 million days worth of pay to the king. So, owing 10,000 talents, Jesus threw out this ridiculous number. because it could never be paid back. The servant that's in this story, would have to work 164,000 years, 7 days a week, without holding any money back for things like, food, and give all of it to the king to pay this loan back. It was a loan that could never be repaid, especially with the status of being a servant. If he was a king or a large landowner or something like that, he could have paid it back. But the reality was this loan could never be repaid. He was going to be indebted for the rest of his days, and his family would be indebted for the rest of their days, and so on until the debt was paid back. It would be a generational problem. And so the king's like, all right, you can't pay this back, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take you, your wife, your kids, and all of the possessions you do have, and I'm going to sell those. It's not going to come close to paying me back, but it'll get me some reimbursement. So the man hears this and immediately begins to beg, essentially, for his freedom and for his family's freedom. The king looks on him with compassion and says, "It's all forgiven. You never have any hope of paying this debt back, so you know what? Don't worry about it. Keep your freedom. Keep the money that I've loaned to you, that you've apparently squandered or something, because that much money should have returned some kind of investment. But apparently this guy was not good with money and lost all of it." He said, "Start over. Start anew." Now, here's why this ridiculous amount is given. Jesus, in this story, is the king, and we are the servant. The servant represents us and the debt that we owe to God for our sin. The servant represents all the failures that we have committed over the years and all the sins that we have done. And the king's forgiveness is the forgiveness that Christ offers. He looks at those that follow him, those that are in relationship with him, and he says, "You could never hope to repay the debt you owe me, but I forgive you. Consider the debt wiped clean because of my death on the cross and because of my resurrection." It was a debt we could never work through. We couldn't earn it. We could not work hard enough to get there. And it is a debt that we consistently rack up. Every single day, we consistently do something else that increases our debt. Every single day we sin. And I say we because I am not exempt from that rule. Just because I've got the name pastor in front of mine does not exempt me from the reality that I am broken. Just ask my wife. She'll confirm that. Or, well, my daughter's like, "Yeah, definitely. Thanks." The reality is that we're all broken and we're all screwed up. We've all sinned. We've all fallen. And it is such a debt that we can't pay it back. We can't work hard enough. So many of us want to be a good person and we want to try hard enough to earn God's favor. But what Scripture tells us over and over and over again is that one sin is enough to undo any good work we could ever do for the rest of our lives. Because God is so holy and just, it only takes one sin to undo a whole lifetime of good. And then the reality of it is, if we really are honest with ourselves, most of the time when we volunteer, most of the time when we do something good, it's because we're hoping to get a good feeling back in return. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that because that's what happens. That's how God designed us. He designed us to enjoy doing good for others. But the problem is a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times we'll do that because it makes me feel good. That's why I did it. I did this to make me feel better about who I am. But the reality is that's not what God calls us to do. The good feeling we get is to be secondary. We do the good things because he did such a great thing for us. And that's why. The good feeling is just a secondary result of doing what he has called us to. So the king looks at the servant and says, all is forgiven. Just as God looks at us when we follow him, when we enter into relationship with him, he says, all is forgiven. Walk in a new life, in new freedom that you didn't get to experience before. So, we offer forgiveness because Christ first forgave us. Remember one of the things that I said too, just something I want you to hang on to. As we look at this next story, remember that forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is not always forgetting. Sometimes we have to forgive. We got to remember what they did because it prevents us from repeating that hurt. In the case, the best example that I can think of to talk about this is the case of an abuse of some kind, whatever that abuse is. Plug it in. When we experience abuse at the hands of someone else, forgiveness still can be offered to that person. It might take a long time to get there, but it can be offered because remember, it's not necessarily for that person. A lot of times it's for us. We offer them forgiveness so we can be set free from them. But we can't forget what they did because if we do, we're going to go back to that situation again and experience the hurt again. And this time it's going to be deeper and it's going to be worse. And so, forgiveness is not always forgetting. So just remember that as we look at this next portion. So it starts off with a relationship between the king and a servant. Now we're going to look at the relationship between the servant and a fellow servant. Okay, so a good way to explain this is it's a vertical relationship, king, servant. Now we're looking at a horizontal relationship, servant to servant. Okay, so picking up in verse 28. That servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. So 4 or 5 months worth of labor, right? Somewhere in that area. He grabbed him, started choking him, and said, "Pay what you owe." So, slightly violent response. At this, his fellow servant fell down and begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you back." But he wasn't willing. Instead, he went and threw him into prison until he could pay what was owed. When the other servants saw what had taken place, they were deeply distressed and went and reported to their master everything that had happened. Then after he had summoned him, his master said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you have also had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" Because he was angry, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay everything that was owed. So also my heavenly Father will do to you unless every one of you forgives his brother or sister. And the key part of that is from your heart. You have to actually mean it. The servant was unwilling to extend the same forgiveness that had been given to him. By comparison, these debts weren't even close to each other. 10,000 talents, which is 60 million denarii, versus just 100 denarii. The guy could have had it worked for a year and paid it off. Huge difference in debt. One is unrepayable. The other one easily repaid. And the servant who had experienced so much forgiveness chose not to extend it to his fellow servant. Once again, we still represent the servant. Jesus is saying we are called to forgive the people near us and around us. Even those that hurt us and wrong us in some way, we are to offer forgiveness to them. It's not easy, it's not simple, but it's what we're called to do, especially if you are a follower of Christ. The servant was unwilling to move past the debt and share the compassion of the king. Often we're willing to extend grace. Often we are unwilling to extend the same grace that was given to us. Oftentimes we are unwilling to take the grace that has been shown to us and show it to others. The other thing is, a lot of times we want grace given to us, but we don't want to have to show it to anybody else. That's what this story is exactly about. Is the servant wanted the compassion and the grace from his king, but then when faced with the opportunity to share it and to show the same compassion and the same grace, he chose not to. He chose to have the man jailed until he could work off the debt in prison, rather than to either give him more time or forgive the debt completely. He could have done either one, and he chose not to. Remember what I said at the beginning. Forgiveness and bitterness are two sides of the same coin. We choose which one to look at. We get to choose which one we want to look at. Do we want to look at bitterness or do we want to look at forgiveness? We get to pick. They don't have to make us. They can't force us to choose bitterness. They can't force us to choose forgiveness. We get to choose. I will say this. This is one thing to remember about this idea of bitterness, and I'm not the one that said this first. I've heard it said by different people. Bitterness is like taking a poison and hoping that it will hurt the other person. It's like me swallowing a poison and hoping that it will hurt the person next to me. Because that's what we're doing, right? With bitterness, we're getting angry and we're mad and we're frustrated and we're all those emotions. And we let them build and build and build. And we're hoping that because we're angry at this person, then they're going to be hurt by it. But the reality is what it does is it hurts us and it hurts the people that are closest to us, because that anger comes out at some point, and typically it's going to come out at the person that we're closest to, or the person that we love the most. And it hurts us, but not the person that did the offense. Choosing to hang on to all of that anger builds and turns into the very poison we hope for the other person. And rather than hurting them, it hurts us. And it allows that person that hurt us, whatever the hurt might have been, it allows that person to keep control over us. Because we spend so much time angry and mad at them for what happened. Versus going, you know what? I'm going to move on past this and I'm going to forgive. Now, once again, I have to say this again. I'm not saying these things because they're easy or that they'll be quick to do. I'm saying these things because they're important for us to work towards. Not that they're going to just happen because we decide to. Because bitterness digs into our souls and it doesn't let go easily. So you have to decide which side of the coin you're going to look at. Which side are you going to choose to focus on? Bitterness is like a weed, and it will begin to affect everything around it, eventually suffocating the healthiest of plants. Bitterness is like a weed. It digs in, and it will choke out all the good around it until all that's left is the bitter weed. And all the sweet plants that might have been growing alongside of it are gone, or at best dying and withering. Which side of the coin do you choose to look at? Now remember, at the end of this story, the servant in this parable ends up paying a price for his bitterness. He chose to become embittered towards the other servant who couldn't pay the debt back. And because of that bitterness, he lost his freedom. He was thrown in jail as a result until he could pay the debt back, which meant he was in jail until he died because he was never going to pay that debt back. Bitterness held on so strong in this man's heart that it cost him everything. All because he was unwilling to extend forgiveness or even grace, just a little bit of grace. I mean, the guy could have been like, look, take a year, pay me back then. He didn't even do that. Threw him right in jail. I need my money now. So the king had not forgotten. He'd forgiven the debt, but he'd not forgotten about it. And when this man chose to not show grace and compassion to his fellow servant, the king recalled the debt and threw him in prison. A few notes on forgiveness that I want to make sure we talk about. The old adage of forgive and forget is crap. We already talked about that a little bit. It will likely lead to more pain. The king had not forgotten the debt. He'd forgiven it, but he'd not forgotten it. We are to forgive someone, but it doesn't mean we act like nothing happened. When we forgive, it doesn't mean we have to have a relationship with that person. It doesn't mean that we move on like nothing ever took place. It doesn't mean that we have to force ourselves to be around them. We can withdraw from that relationship if necessary. But we can still offer forgiveness and not have anything to do with them anymore. Forgiveness is not as much for the other person as it is for the one that was hurt. When we forgive, we remove the ability for that person to hold power over us. By forgiving those that came after me at the place that I was fired from, by forgiving them, I was able to move on. I was able, to return to what God had called me to do. By forgiving them, I was able to come back to living life in church. Is that easy still? No, it's not easy. There's still pain that comes with that. There's still pain for my family that comes with that. But if I had not forgiven those people, bitterness would have set in, and I would have lived my life out angry and unhappy and unable to have relationship with those people around me that I wanted with the most. Because I forgave them, I was set free. We offer forgiveness because Christ first forgave us. A couple of questions, as I've come to enjoy doing. And if you've been coming for a while, you've noticed that this is a pattern. We're going to close with a couple questions. For the Christian, for those of you that are already followers of Christ, are you offering forgiveness the way that you have been forgiven? It's a tough question. Are you offering forgiveness the way you have been forgiven? Maybe you're not in a relationship with Christ right now. Maybe you haven't experienced what that's like. So that's my question. For the non-Christian, for the non-follower of Christ, have you experienced the forgiveness offered by God? Father, thank you so much that you took a debt that was one we could never hope to repay. That no matter how hard we worked, we would never be good enough. We would never have enough saved up to pay our debt back to you because our sin is too great. Thank you that you said, I'll take the debt. I'll pay the price so that you can be forgiven. All we have to do is accept that grace. All we have to do is accept your forgiveness. God, it's not easy for us as humans to offer forgiveness to someone that's hurt us. And if we're honest, God, sometimes we feel like that we can't forgive you for something that's happened in our lives. Sometimes we even blame you for what's happened. But God, forgiveness is not for ourselves. Forgiveness is not for the person that hurt us, God, but it's so that we can experience the freedom of letting go. We forgive not because it's easy. We forgive not because we always want to. We forgive because you forgave us first. And you've called us to offer the same forgiveness that you have. You've forgiven us for a debt that we could never pay back, and you forgive us every single day for continuing to add to that debt. And then you say, do the same. It's not easy. It's not simple. But it's always worth it. God, we pray that you would go with us, that you would help us to extend grace and forgiveness to those around us, to those that have hurt us, no matter how deep the hurt is. God, maybe it will be a process. Maybe it's something that will take time to let go of that bitterness, to let go of the hurt. But God, maybe today is the day we begin that journey so that we can experience you to the fullest. And so that maybe, just maybe, the one that has offended us can experience your grace as well. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day.